Winter 1943, Maryland Underground Naval Laboratory, USA. The air below the hills was colder than the surface world, chilled by concrete walls and the constant breath of machinery. Fluorescent lights buzzed like trapped insects above a long steel firing tunnel buried deep beneath layers of earth and secrecy. Frost clung faintly to exposed pipes. A single slab of dull gray metal stood bolted to a reinforced test frame at the far end of the chamber. It was no thicker than a man's hand. No markings, no polish, no visible distinction from thousands of other experimental plates that had failed in this same room. 300 feet away, locked into a massive rail system, rested one of the most lethal objects ever forged by human hands. A full-scale naval armor-piercing shell. The same class of projectile that had already sent battleships to the bottom of the Atlantic and the Pacific. Its nose was hardened steel, its body packed with explosive force designed to punch through feet of armor before detonating inside living ships. Behind 8 inches of armored glass, naval engineers stood silent. Not one spoke. Even their breathing seemed too loud. At the edge of the observation platform stood a single civilian figure in a dark coat. Dr. Elias Korrin, metallurgist, the man who claimed that this unremarkable gray plate could do what no steel on Earth had ever done before. A red warning light flashed once. Then the rail fired. The shell vanished in a thunderclap. The chamber shook as if the hillside itself had been struck by an earthquake. Pressure slammed into the observation glass. Steam exploded outward in a white cloud. Instruments screamed. For 2 full seconds, no human eye could see what had happened on the impact wall. When the steam finally thinned, the impossible stood revealed. The battleship-grade shell had shattered into fragments. The steel plate remained standing. There was no cheer, no applause, only stunned silence as engineers leaned forward, searching for some trick of light, some hidden fracture that would explain away what they had just witnessed. None appeared. The plate was scarred, blackened, slightly bowed at the center, but it had not been penetrated. In that frozen moment, history changed in absolute secrecy. And if stories like this matter to you, if you value these hidden moments that shaped the war but were buried in silence, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from around the world. These lost chapters of history endure only because people like you choose to carry them forward. No official report would ever record that test. No journalists would be summoned. No photographs would be released. Within hours, the alloy's designation was stripped from the laboratory's filing system. Within days, its very existence was elevated beyond the classification level of the Manhattan Project. Within weeks, the Navy Intelligence Division gave it a name that was never meant to be spoken aloud. Outlaw steel, not because it violated any law of man, but because it violated the laws of metallurgy itself. Dr. Elias Korrin had arrived at the Maryland facility only months earlier, quietly transferred from a civilian research institute with no public explanation. He was not a celebrity scientist. No published theories had made his name known. To most of the naval engineers, he had been little more than a gaunt figure in a lab coat who moved through the corridors without companions and spoke only when directly questioned. Even then, his answers were sparse. Yet within those same corridors, rumors had begun to circulate long before the test. Stories that his experiments were different, that his samples behaved strangely under heat and pressure, that several plates had liquefied and resolidified in shapes no known alloy should form, that one assistant had asked for immediate reassignment after witnessing what happened when Korrin pushed his process too far. On the day of the test, Korrin had said almost nothing. He had simply watched from the shadows as technicians positioned the plate. He did not flinch when the alarm sounded. He did not turn away when the shell fired. He merely stood, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the gray surface, as if he already knew the outcome. After the chamber was declared safe, engineers approached the impact wall with cautious steps. They pressed gauges against the warped metal. They took temperature readings. They searched for microfractures with lamps and magnifiers. The instruments confirmed what their eyes struggled to accept. The energy that should have ripped through the steel had been absorbed, dispersed, and silenced within the plate itself. No known steel behaved this way. The immediate military implications were so staggering that they eclipsed comprehension. Battleships at that moment were locked in a deadly arms race with shell designers. Every increment of thicker armor was met by a heavier, faster, more destructive projectile. Warship survival depended on a narrow balance of weight, buoyancy, and resistance. The wrong calculation could turn a capital ship into a steel coffin. But this alloy suggested something unheard of. Armor that could defeat not just current shells, but future ones as well. Armor that did not rely solely on thickness. Armor that defeated energy itself. Within hours of the test, Korrin was escorted into a secure briefing chamber. He did not emerge until long after midnight. When he finally returned to his quarters, a sentry now stood at his door. His research had passed from science to weapon at the speed of war. What followed happened without ceremony. The alloy formula was sealed. Only 5 copies were authorized to exist. Each was divided into coded segments stored in separate classified vaults. Korrin himself was ordered never to reconstruct the full process again without direct authorization. Even within the laboratory, no assistant would ever witness all phases of the production. Knowledge itself was now fragmented as a weapon. Within 6 months, the first operational batch of Outlaw steel armor was prepared for deployment. It did not go to a new ship. It was too experimental for that. Instead, sections of existing armor plates were quietly removed under the cover of routine maintenance at a Pacific dry dock. Replacement panels, outwardly identical in dimension and finish, were installed along critical areas of a frontline battleship's hull. Only a small circle of officers knew which vessel now carried the forbidden metal. Even the ship's captain was kept in the dark. The battleship sailed with no fanfare. Weeks later, far from American shores, enemy reconnaissance finally found her. The first hostile shells arrived in low light. Distant flashes on the horizon. Seconds later, the roar. Giant columns of water rose alongside the hull. Then came direct hits. Steel screamed. Fire burst across the deck. Crewmen braced for catastrophe, as they had trained to do 100 times before. But catastrophe did not come. Shell after shell struck and failed. Impacts left scars, but no breach. Explosions that should have torn open the ship's side instead bloomed outward, deflected, neutralized. Inside engineering spaces, men waited for flooding that never arrived. Damage control crews stood ready for fires that never spread. The ship did not slow. It did not list. It did not die. Enemy gunners increased their rate of fire. Heavier rounds followed. Still the hull held. By the time the battleship disengaged and withdrew under cover of smoke, she had absorbed punishment that should have sent her to the ocean floor. Back in port days later, inspectors moved quietly along blackened plating. Paint was scorched. Steel was bent. But no hole pierced the forbidden metal beneath. The crew would later speak in low voices of the battle that should have ended them. Official logs used cautious terminology. Unusual armor performance. Unexpected survivability. No one wrote the truth. Naval doctrine shifted silently thereafter. Deployment strategies changed. Risk calculations altered. Unknown to most of the fleet, a single metallurgist's work was beginning to reshape how American warships would face enemy fire. Yet even as his alloy changed the war at sea, its creator was unraveling behind locked doors. 2 months after the miracle battle, Dr. Elias Korrin vanished. His laboratory was found exactly as he had last left it. Tools aligned. Notes locked within a fireproof safe. No overturned furniture. No broken entry points. No sign of struggle. His personal effects remained in his quarters. His civilian identification was still in a desk drawer. His coat hung untouched on its hook. The official Navy memorandum listed his status as reassigned overseas. But within military intelligence, another story spread in whispers. 3 days before his disappearance, Korrin had attempted to destroy his own work. Security logs showed him requesting access to multiple segments of the formula without proper authorization. When denied, he had grown uncharacteristically agitated. One technician later reported seeing him striking a metal sample with a hammer again and again long after midnight, as if trying to provoke it into revealing some hidden truth. Another witness claimed Korrin had been heard muttering a single phrase in the empty lab. "It doesn't want to stay stable." By the morning of his disappearance, the unusual behavior had stopped. By nightfall, so had Korrin himself. No public investigation followed. No bulletin was issued. No obituary printed his name. Within classified archives, his personnel file was sealed alongside the alloy's formula. The war surged forward. New battles were fought. New ships were launched. Outlaw steel quietly protected hulls in places no historian would ever publicly document. And with time, the name of Elias Korrin began to fade even within the Navy's inner corridors. People assumed the mystery had ended. They were wrong, because more than 3 decades later, during a peacetime inspection on one of the most famous battleships ever built, engineers would uncover a section of hull that did not belong to any known era of human industry. And the steel they found would force the Navy to confront a question it had kept buried since winter of 1943. Where had Outlaw steel truly come from? And what had Dr. Elias Korrin discovered that made him try to erase his own creation before vanishing without a trace? The answers would not surface easily. They never do when steel itself keeps the secret. The disappearance of Dr. Elias Korrin should have triggered alarms that rippled through every layer of the Navy. Instead, it sank into the paperwork like a stone into deep water. There were no active searches, no public inquiries, no official statements beyond the 2-word explanation that closed the matter with brutal finality. Reassigned overseas. Yet inside the intelligence corridors, the behavior was anything but dismissive. Within hours of Korrin's vanishing, his laboratory was stripped to its bones. Every experimental plate was removed under armed guard. Every tool was cataloged. Every scrap of paper was photographed, duplicated, and sealed away. Even the floor was scraped for metallic residue. The safe that held his working notebooks was opened with explosives when the combination could not be produced. Inside, dozens of pages were found missing, torn cleanly at the binding as if removed with deliberate calm rather than panic. The remaining notes raised more questions than they answered. Korrin's handwriting, once neat and precise, grew erratic in the final weeks of entries. Several pages contained formula fragments that did not align with any known metallurgical model. Temperature values appeared where none should exist. Crystalline lattice diagrams showed impossible angles. Margins were crowded with corrections written atop corrections, as if the underlying behavior of the alloy was shifting faster than the model could be stabilized. Then came the line that unsettled the analysts most. This behavior is not consistent with any closed system. The phrase alone contradicted the foundations of material science. Steel was supposed to be predictable. Stress in, deformation out. Energy could be measured, mapped, controlled. Yet Korrin's work suggested that something inside his alloy was reacting in ways that defied the isolation of the laboratory itself. For months after his disappearance, Naval Intelligence quietly attempted to reproduce the Outlaw process using the segmented formula copies stored in separate vaults. Each team worked blind to the full design. Each was authorized only a narrow window of the method. Every attempt failed. Some plates cracked under heat. Others shattered under impact. One liquefied without warning and destroyed its entire testing apparatus. By the end of the year, all replication programs were halted. The Navy still possessed the original Outlaw steel already installed in select hull sections. But its creation had died with its maker. Officially, unofficially, one intelligence division refused to close the file. They retraced every step of Korrin's career backward. His civilian research postings, his early academic work, his wartime transfer orders. They interviewed former colleagues who now occupied quiet academic offices and industrial labs across the country. Many struggled to remember him clearly. Some recalled a brilliant but withdrawn figure. Others remembered an intensity that seemed misplaced in peacetime metallurgy. A former laboratory partner described him as a man who listened more than he spoke. A man who was never satisfied with surface behavior. A man who treated steel not as metal, but as something alive under pressure. None of them could explain how he had made the leap that produced Outlaw steel. One detail surfaced again and again, buried inside dry personnel records. Korrin had spent 6 months prior to his Navy recruitment at a remote civilian reclamation site tied to a defunct mining operation in the American Southwest. Officially, the site processed contaminated industrial scrap. Unofficially, its classified annex files were still sealed under a defense exemption that predated the war. When investigators attempted to open those files, their requests were denied. The rejections did not come from the Navy. They came from agencies that technically did not exist. As the war ground on, attention shifted elsewhere. The Atlantic convoys still bled. The Pacific burned island by island. Outlaw steel remained hidden beneath layers of battleship armor, silently surviving impacts few would ever learn about. The alloy became a ghost in the Navy's own records. It was trusted when it worked. It was avoided in documentation. Officers who knew of it rotated out of service. Others passed away. With time, even classified memory decays. By 1945, the Korrin file was closed not with answers, but with exhaustion. Decades passed. Wars ended. New wars began. Nuclear weapons changed the meaning of naval power. Battleships faded from the center of doctrine. Some were mothballed. Others were turned into museums. The steel that had once absorbed the deadliest shells of its age now rusted quietly beneath layers of preserved paint. Then, in the 1970s, a routine decision reopened everything. The great battleships were slated for structural analysis as part of a classified modernization review. Engineers were tasked with mapping stress points across hulls that had survived both enemy fire and 30 years of saltwater fatigue. Ultrasonic scanners were run along armor seams. Core samples were extracted from select areas where replacement logs were vague. It was supposed to be a by-the-book inspection. It became anything but. One core sample taken from a critical belt section returned results that made no sense. Its atomic composition differed measurably from every known wartime steel standard. Alloy ratios were offset by trace elements no industrial facility from the 1940s should have been able to control with that precision. Even more disturbing, the crystalline structure displayed under electron microscopy mirrored the same impossible lattice patterns sketched in the margins of Korrin's missing notebooks. Engineers ran the test again. The results were identical. At that moment, the war that had ended on paper in 1945 quietly resumed in the laboratory. And if this hidden continuation of the story has you questioning everything you thought you knew about naval history, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends right now and tell us where you're watching from across the world. The deeper we go, the stranger it becomes. Modern metallurgists tried to model the alloy's behavior using contemporary physics. The simulations failed. Energy absorption readings fluctuated slightly with no predictable strain curves. The steel did not simply distribute impact through mass. It appeared to redirect it internally along pathways that no conventional lattice should permit. The conclusion that formed behind closed doors was one no official report ever stated plainly. Whatever Korrin had created, it still could not be fully explained with modern science. That discovery triggered a quiet audit of battleship maintenance archives stretching back to the last years of the war. Thousands of handwritten plating logs were scanned. Serial numbers were cross-checked. Replacement dates were reconstructed. The deeper the analysts looked, the more inconsistency surfaced. Complete sections of armor replacement records were missing. Not misplaced, removed. And the removals followed a pattern. Every missing log corresponded to compartments that post-war scans now identified as containing anomalous steel. Someone long ago had not only installed Outlaw steel in more ships than officially acknowledged. Someone had erased the trail afterward. The deeper the audit progressed, the more uncomfortable the implications became. The number of hull sections involved far exceeded the experimental batches authorized under Korrin's documented production capacity. Either additional alloy had been created somewhere beyond the Maryland laboratory, or additional production lines had existed without ever appearing in Navy procurement records. Such a conclusion carried an implication no investigator could openly voice. Korrin may not have been working alone, or worse, he may not have been working entirely under American authority. Files were quietly forwarded to agencies whose initials did not appear on any public letterhead. Joint task groups were formed using personnel who technically belonged to separate chains of command. The investigation stopped resembling a historical inquiry. It began to resemble a containment operation. Then came the margin note. It appeared in an overlooked engineering addendum attached to a damaged 1944 armor replacement report that had escaped earlier audits. The bulk of the document was routine: measurements, rivet counts, weld inspections. At the bottom corner of one page, almost erased by time and repeated copying, analysts found a handwritten line added as an afterthought. This steel was never fully mine. The signature beneath it matched Korrin's hand. The meaning struck like delayed thunder. If the formula had not truly been his, then where had it originated? If the steel had not been fully his, then who had shared it, or guided it, or demanded its creation? And why had he tried to destroy it before vanishing? If this moment just shifted your understanding of everything that came before it, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends now, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. These are the questions history never intended to answer publicly. Modern analysts attempted to trace the atomic fingerprints of the anomalous steelback through known metallurgical supply chains. They searched mining records, smelting facilities, experimental alloy programs archived during the war. Every trail ended in blank space. The trace elements did not align with any known or refining process used anywhere in the continental United States at that time. One analyst proposed that the unusual composition could only have been achieved through precision layering under controlled vacuum environments that did not exist in the 1940s. Another countered that the internal lattice resembled no naturally occurring metallic crystal structure known on Earth. The suggestion that followed was never written down, but it was heard, and it changed the temperature of every meeting that followed. As the investigation deepened, bridges began to quietly close. Requests for further core sampling were delayed. Certain hull sections were declared off-limits under vague preservation authorities. The modernization program itself was partially scaled back without explanation. Analysts who pushed too far found their access downgraded. Some were transferred. Others were simply told that their services were no longer required. The pattern from 1943 repeated itself with uncanny precision. Outlaw steel was being buried again. But one thing had changed. The investigators now knew that the metal inside those hulls was not simply superior armor. It was an anomaly that had never belonged in its own time. And somewhere, beneath layers of classification and silence, the ghost of Dr. Elias Korrin was still moving through the machinery of history. The war he had shaped had ended. The war over the truth of what he created was only just beginning. Decades after the margin note was discovered and quietly sealed, Outlaw steel slipped once more into armed silence. Officially, the modernization program returned to routine. The anomalous core samples were archived. The engineers who had raised the fiercest objections found themselves reassigned to projects with no relevance to hull metallurgy. The battleships were preserved, repurposed, or mothballed. Visitors walked their decks. Children posed for photographs beside guns that once shook continents. Beneath their feet, the forbidden metal remained hidden in plain sight. Outlaw steel endured. Salt water gnawed at it. Heat tested it. Mechanical stress accumulated across generations of storms and tides. Yet the alloy behaved the same way it always had. It aged differently, It fatigued slowly. It resisted corrosion where neighboring steel bloomed with rust. Modern instruments still struggled to predict how it redistributed stress during impact events. What Korrin had created in a sealed Maryland chamber during the darkest winter of the war remained, in practical terms, beyond full explanation. The investigation never officially resumed. But questions never truly die when evidence continues to exist. In the years that followed, fragments of classified correspondence surfaced in decommissioned files and misplaced archives. They were incomplete, redacted, often badly degraded by time. But taken together, they revealed a pattern of concern that never entirely faded. Multiple agencies continued to monitor the structural behavior of specific hull sections without ever openly acknowledging why. Sampling data was still quietly updated during routine maintenance on museum ships. Access to certain compartments remained restricted under vague security exemptions that no longer fit any modern threat framework. The justification persisted without explanation, and at the center of it remained one absent man. Dr. Elias Korrin did not reappear under another name. No matching death certificate ever surfaced in public record. No foreign intelligence service ever claimed him as an asset. No recovered defector ever spoke his name. For all outward purposes, he had vanished as thoroughly as if he had never existed. Yet he persisted in the data, the peculiarities of his handwriting in engineering margins, the oddly precise calibration decisions embedded inside Outlaw steel structure, the repeated mathematical shorthand that only appeared in his personal research entries. The alloy itself remained, in effect, a silent fingerprint that could not be erased without destroying the ships that carried it. One unanswered question grew heavier with time. If Korrin had truly acted alone, then the impossibilities encoded in Outlaw steel belonged solely to one extraordinary mind working under impossible pressure. But if he had not acted alone, then the implications widened into territory no military historian could comfortably map. To explore that possibility, modern analysts attempted what earlier investigators could not. They studied not the end product, but the transitional stages that Korrin's partial notes suggested must have existed during the alloy's formation. Experimental heating curves, phase transition markers, pressure gradients that hinted at processes not standard to steelmaking. Each reconstruction attempt failed in predictable fashion. Energy absorption collapsed. Lattice stability unraveled. Shock dispersion reverted to ordinary mechanical deformation. The metal behaved like metal again. Only the original alloy refused to cooperate with known physics. One analyst, nearing retirement, expressed the conclusion no official report would carry. "What we're studying isn't advanced steel," he said. "It's steel that learned a rule we don't know yet." That idea, while never formally adopted, lingered. There was also the problem of scale. Official records suggested only small experimental batches of Outlaw steel had ever been produced under Korrin's direct supervision. But the post-war audit revealed anomalous material in quantities that far exceeded those documented limits. Entire longitudinal hull sections carried the forbidden signature. Reinforcement plates in critical compartments showed the same atomic mismatch. Even some internal bracing elements contained trace matches to the Outlaw profile. Someone had produced far more alloy than Korrin alone could have fabricated under the documented timeline. And they had done so without leaving an industrial footprint. No smelter records. No transportation manifests. No procurement logs. The absence became its own accusation. As the decades progressed, the very nature of naval warfare changed. Guided missiles replaced heavy shells. Aircraft carriers eclipsed battleships. The dreadnoughts that once ruled the seas became technological fossils. Their role passed. Their classification softened. Their decks filled with tourists instead of sailors. Outlaw steel remained embedded within their frames, quietly surviving into an age it had never been designed for. Sometimes, when extreme storms battered museum ships along exposed coastlines, sensors would record anomalous stress behavior along specific hull bands. The data would be forwarded, reviewed quietly, filed without commentary. The alloy continued to perform. The questions continued to accumulate. Why had Korrin tried to destroy his own work days before he vanished? What had he discovered inside the structure of his creation that had frightened him? Why had the Navy buried his name instead of celebrating it? And why had the trail of production been systematically erased? No official explanation ever emerged to satisfy all of them. But fragments of Korrin's final weeks survived in unofficial memory. A laboratory assistant, interviewed decades later under condition of anonymity, recalled a subtle change in Korrin not long before his disappearance. He had always been quiet. That did not change. What changed, she said, was his certainty. Before he looked like a man building something, she recalled. Then he looked like a man who had found something he didn't put there. She remembered him staring at a cooling plate long after its formation had ended, fingertips resting just above the surface, as though he were hesitant to touch it. She remembered him asking one question repeatedly in different forms. Why does it stabilize there? Not how. Why? Another recollection surfaced from a security officer who had monitored late-night activity outside Korrin's lab. He described hearing metal being struck rhythmically long after authorized testing had ceased. He described Korrin working alone, hammering a finished sample again and again as if attempting to provoke a flaw that refused to appear. When the officer asked if everything was all right, Korrin had looked up with an expression the officer struggled to name. "It shouldn't be that quiet," Korrin had said. When the officer asked what he meant, Korrin did not answer. He simply returned to his work. Within 72 hours, he was gone. No one ever officially acknowledged whether Korrin had left the facility under escort, under coercion, or under his own power. Security footage from the relevant time window was reported as improperly archived. Gate logs showed anomalies that could not later be resolved. Vehicle movement records were incomplete. It was as if the moment of his departure had been deliberately smoothed out of the historical surface. The alloy he left behind behaved as though it had never received that order. Modern theoretical physicists occasionally encounter anonymized datasets drawn from naval metallurgy archives. They study stress dispersion curves that do not align with any closed model. They propose exotic explanations in academic circles that never touch defense publication channels. Most dismiss the anomalies as artifacts of aging hardware or undocumented alloy blends from a bygone era. A few do not. Those few tend not to publish long. Across the years, Outlaw Steel accumulated stories without receiving explanations. It acquired legend without documentation. It became one more unexplained footnote inside the vast machinery of a war that had already generated too many mysteries of its own. And in quiet moments, when the museum decks closed and the harbor fell still, the steel inside those hulls continued to bear forces far smaller than the ones it was born to tame. It remembered greater impacts. It had once absorbed the deadliest shells ever fired in naval history. It still carried that knowledge. So did the archives. What ultimately unsettled the modern analysts most was not what the alloy did, but what it suggested. If Outlaw Steel truly represented a leap that material science had still not closed after nearly a century, then the innovation curve of wartime metallurgy contained a discontinuity that no official history could account for. The war had accelerated research. That much was known. But acceleration alone did not explain a phenomenon still unmatched generations later. Something else had intervened. Whether that intervention took the form of a forgotten human collaboration, an unknown industrial process, or a piece of knowledge that arrived out of sequence, no surviving record confirmed. Only the margin note remained. This steel was never fully mine. The sentence continued to resist interpretation. It could be read as guilt, as confession, as warning, as acknowledgement of guidance received from an unseen hand. Each generation of investigators interpreted it differently. None resolved it. In the end, the most enduring effect of Outlaw Steel may not be its mechanical superiority or its quiet role in saving lives during a critical year of the war. It may be the boundary it exposed between what humanity believed it understood about matter and what still lay beyond explanation. Steel should be obedient to heat and force. Outlaw steel was not. It absorbed violence and returned silence. It followed rules no one could fully describe. It arrived in a time that was not prepared to explain it. And it remained behind when its creator vanished into classification and rumor. Somewhere beneath layers of paint, beneath decades of salt and wind, beneath rivets laid by hands long turned to dust, fragments of that impossible metal still rest inside the hulls of America's greatest warships. The war that proved it has faded into memory. The mystery that created it has not. And if a story of outlaw steel teaches anything, it may be this. History does not always move in clean lines. Sometimes it bends around secrets strong enough to survive both fire and forgetting. If stories like this matter to you, if these forgotten currents beneath the surface of history compel you to look closer, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from right now. These mysteries endure because you choose to keep asking the questions others were never meant to answer.